May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be always acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Well, I think we have all experienced being on trips with families or friends when it reaches a point when we've been traveling a bit too long for some. Are we there yet? Do we have to stop here? So we can all relate, even a little bit, to the Israelites grumbling in the desert. At this point in the story that we hear this morning, the Israelites are beginning their second month of walking in the wilderness following their flight from Egypt. And it is understandable that they might be a bit grumpy. God has brought them to this place where they get hungry and they need to speak up, and God hears their struggle and answers them. Throughout the book of Exodus, God's purpose in liberating the Israelites is not simply to bring them to a destination, a promised land, but to establish a new, exclusive relationship with them and to dwell among them. And so God tells Moses that God will rain bread from heaven for the Israelites, and each day they must go out and gather just enough for that day. But this bread from heaven is totally unrecognizable to the Israelites, and they ask, "What is it?" And that is a literal translation of manna. What is it? And yet, between their gathering of this stuff, this bread from heaven each morning, and the quails provided each evening, they are fed and sustained by God. And if they try to gather too much manna and try to store it up for another day, it becomes foul and breeds worms. And so the Israelites need to trust God. They need to trust that each morning, as they come out of their tents, God will have rained bread from heaven for them. And they need to trust each other, that each will gather as much as she or he needs. And so the Israelites and God continue to live into and deepen their relationship. The wilderness, which had begun to feel like a place of death, becomes a place in which God nurtures and cares for God's people, seeking life and renewal over death and stagnation, in calling God's people to new places and new ways of being in relationship with God and with each other. And we all find ourselves in wilderness at one time or another, especially right now. Wilderness of the unknown, of uncertainty, of insecurity. Wilderness in which we do not have many options but to trust God. Trust that God will give us each day what we need, not necessarily what we want. And it might not be as much as we want. It might be just enough. And sometimes this sustenance, this bread from heaven, might be totally unrecognizable to us, and it is not until much later that we realize how it has sustained us. And it is interesting that this story is paired in the lectionary with the parable of the laborers in the vineyard. Those who had been laboring all day grumbled that those who had started late in the day did not deserve to be paid the same amount of money as those who had been working all day. Those late arrivals had not earned it, to which the landowner responds, this wasn't about having earned anything, it was about generosity, his generosity. Frederick Buechner is correct. Money has value when there isn't enough for everyone. And that's what those who had been laboring all day felt. They felt devalued. It all should have been about what they had rightly earned. But from the owner's point of view, this abundance was all about his generosity. In the story of the Israelites being fed in the wilderness, at first they were grateful for what they received, but then some wanted more. They started getting up earlier to gather the manna. They tried to hoard it, but that didn't work out. Hoarding manna only breeds worms and rot. Yesterday, Bishop Hughes noted that she'd like to reframe the phrase food insecurity to remembering that there are folks going to bed tonight hungry. And we have a part in helping God rain bread from heaven. Especially in these days, how are we being brought into a new place and being invited to relate to God and to our neighbors in a new way? And it is perfectly all right to ask in the midst of this, to turn to God with what the heck is going on here right now? God, what the heck is all of this? Sometimes when we step out of our tents in the morning to gather what God provides for our sustenance each day, we do indeed find that it is simply unrecognizable. It is always so much easier to look back on previous times in the wilderness when we did eventually recognize that bread from heaven which God had provided to strengthen and sustain us. Years ago, when we first moved into our house in Denville, my husband at the time dug out at the side of our house a small plot for a vegetable garden. Small plot, just big enough to have some tomato plants, some pole beans, and a few herbs. And that was his garden, his project, and our children loved to help him with it. Well, when the first spring came, some years later, but many years ago now, that first spring when it was just my daughter, my son, and myself living in the house, my son was all gung-ho that he and I would do the garden on our own. And growing up, my mom and dad always had a huge vegetable garden, but I was not a big fan of weeding, hoeing, picking beans. There were just too many snakes. So taking on the preparation of even this small plot and planting and caring for it with my son was a new challenge for me. And yet, I found I loved it. I loved it all, from the composting to the picking. And my time in the garden, especially weeding, unexpectedly turned out to be very grounding time for me in the midst of a period of great upheaval in our family. But some of the most nurturing manna came in the form of the wisdom, humor, and immense gardening knowledge of my next door neighbor, Inga. a woman with an incredible green thumb and pure love of puttering around outside. But especially at that time, for me, a woman who had been through a divorce many years earlier and had known the challenges of raising 2 children on her own and had done it all very well. Inge and I had said hello to each other and exchanged brief small talk for years, but it wasn't until I was in that wilderness of grieving that I stepped out of my tent and into that garden and started gathering the wisdom, humor, and friendship that a neighbor had to offer me. An offering of sustenance and strength, sometimes given over a beer at the end of a yard work day, at the end of a gardening day. And only with time have I realized how powerful and sustaining that simple bread from heaven was and is. What have been those experiences of bread from heaven in your life? Perhaps only recognizable in hindsight, those surprises and reminders that God is faithful. And I think as we begin to process what these past months and coming months bring for us, we will begin to see gifts which might have been unrecognizable at first as bread from heaven, but that actually help to feed and sustain us through this wilderness. As Christ has taught us to pray, give us this day our daily bread, in whatever form that manna may take. Give us this day our daily bread, that we may live as freed and faithful people with our God and with each other. Amen.